We just heard from John Bolton, obviously, and for those of you at home, thank you for joining us on the live stream. I forgot to mention that earlier. We're live streaming this to I don't know how many people, but so we just heard from Ambassador Bolton. Millions.
And the NSA.
And the NSA is watching, yeah, hopefully. Hi.
Yeah.
So we heard from Bolton, obviously, excuse me. And now we are going to get to hear the opposite perspective, the exact opposite perspective from Ben Wizner, who is
Perhaps I don't even need to speak.
Yeah, no. Ben Wizner is the director of the ACLU's Speech Privacy and Technology Project since 2001, where you litigate cases that are sort of involving civil liberties and security issues. And I think you were involved in the major case about rendition and torture. So that's sort of one of the many things you're involved in. So
one of the things that we wouldn't have known about but for leaks to the press and whistleblowers.
We know your perspective now,
right.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it sounds like he's not. It sounds like Bolton was not saying that we should just blindly trust the government. I mean, what do you make of this concept that there are constitutional checks and we should accept it? It is working efficiently and we can always improve it, but this is the system.
Well, this was a very interesting response. It was the first line of government response to Snowden's revelations. First of all, it was the president saying, we welcome the debate. Well, that was odd because we needed the revelations in order to start the debate. And the second was, there's plenty of constitutional oversight here. There are checks and balances. These programs have been blessed by all three branches of government. And I think we need to look a little bit more closely at that assertion. Certainly all three branches deserve some blame for the failures of oversight that have taken place. But what kind of congressional oversight was there? Well, we now have the Republican and Democratic authors of the Patriot Act coming forward and saying, we never wrote that. It was never our understanding that Section 215 of the Patriot Act would be used to collect telephone records of every single American. They might call it a foreign intelligence program, but when it's collecting telephone records for every single American, let's look at what they do and not what the label is. We have seen two former judges of the FISA court, the secret court, come forward and say, we have a problem here. Our procedures are not only too secret, but they're too one-sided. We were trying to decide difficult constitutional and statutory questions with only the government arguing in front of us. If you read in today's New York Times, Judge Carr, who sat on the FISA court, said, we need an adversary process. I needed to hear another point of view before I was deciding these kinds of things. So to say that the oversight systems that we have in place were effective, I think is rebutted by the very entities that were responsible for that oversight.
But haven't they been given, I guess, sort of constitutional authority? Congress has signed off on a lot of this. Congress, even if it's secretive, Congress is involved. I mean, isn't
I think also we need to point out, so every time we've tried to challenge these programs in ordinary federal courts, the ones that people know about and the ones where the judges hear from parties other than the government and where you can actually appeal to higher courts, every time we've gone to those courts and tried to challenge the legality of these programs, the government hasn't responded by saying these programs are perfectly legal and let's have an argument about it. They've responded by saying you don't have standing to be here, this is a state secret, and this case has to be dismissed without any adjudication of the laws or facts.
Thou dost protest too much, you're saying? Or?
Right, and this is what happens every time we try to challenge, and all we're asking for is for a court to adjudicate the legality of these programs. And in the last 10 years, every one of the surveillance, the torture, the rendition cases that we've brought has been dismissed not on the merits, but on justiciability grounds, because the government has said this is too secret, the defendants are immune, the plaintiffs don't have standing. If they're confident that these programs are legal, in our system of government, the courts ought to have the last word, and in a way in which the public can have some confidence, not in a secret proceeding where the judges are now complaining that they didn't even have two sides.
And so it sounds like you wouldn't see it as a conflict between liberty and security. You don't think there's a trade-off in that?
I don't think it's necessary to say that there is never a trade-off. I certainly don't think that it's a zero-sum game.
Right.
What I don't think is that so much of our government's activities, core activities about war and peace, about surveillance, about foreign policy, should be the province of a small number of people who have security clearances, with the only information that reaches the public coming from leakers, whistleblowers, and intrepid investigative journalists. I think, whatever you think about the outcome of this debate, can't we all agree that it's good that we're having it? And look at the hearings that have taken place in Congress over the last 2 weeks. Look at the questions that members of both parties have put to national security officials and the very awkward answers that they've received. Look at the constitutional challenges that have been filed in court with a better chance of overcoming those justiciability hurdles. It helps, of course, that the ACLU happens to be a Verizon business customer.
Yeah.
So I think we might actually have standing this time to see if this program is legal or illegal, but let a judge decide.
So speaking of Verizon, I guess the case that's being made by Ambassador Bolton and many others is that it's not actually surveillance, it's just collection of data. It's not, we're not, like you said, there's no cameras in your bedroom looking at you. It's just data.
Well, I think the argument that the government wants us all to accept, they want you to understand it publicly and they want courts to accept it legally, is that no act of legal significance even occurs when the government is sweeping up all of our communications and storing them. So now it's metadata, but the same logic could apply to anything else. That the only time the law comes in and has anything to say is when a human being in the government wants to query a database and actually investigate a person. And so there's no legal impediment, according to the NSA and the Department of Justice, to their collecting all of this information so long as no one actually looks at it. But again, if that's true, why couldn't the government put cameras in all of our bedrooms as long as they won't actually look at the tape unless there's a rape allegation? Why couldn't they put recording devices everywhere we go as long as it's only stored in a computer and we don't look at it? I mean, I think, one of the, I think, strong objections to that is that if the government has a surveillance time machine of all of our communications, all of our associations, all of our friends, our contacts, our movements, even if the government, the NSA, isn't interested in us right now, as Ambassador Bolton said, all it takes is for one of us or someone who's 1 or 2 hops away from us to fall under some kind of suspicion somewhere down the road, and the government will be able to recreate all these details of our lives that really it has no business knowing. And in that sense, I think there is a difference if this data is stored in a company and if it's stored in the government. It really does alter the balance of power between the state and an individual.
You say that this isn't really important information for the government to have, but I think there are some people who would say this is important information, especially after an attack. I mean, it was useful after Boston, right?
Well, again, Boston is a very different model, right? I mean, Boston didn't have a centralized system of government-run cameras where they could watch everything, right? Yeah, I mean, Boston was a different model. It was a diffuse network of mostly privately owned cameras, cell phone cameras, store cameras. When there was this catastrophic event, they were able to bring that information together, get the evidence, look at it, and catch the perpetrators. I think that is a more civil liberties-friendly model. I think we also should point out about Boston what we all have known about surveillance cameras. They are an effective forensic tool for solving crimes. They don't prevent serious crimes, certainly not violent crimes when people are committed to doing violence. But let me take your question seriously and say, let me concede that a government that has all of our telephone metadata is likely to catch more bad guys over time. I don't know that it'll prevent more terrorism. I don't have a lot of faith in their technologies and their algorithms for finding needles in the ever-growing haystacks. There just aren't a lot of terrorists. One of my colleagues is fond of saying that more Americans were killed last year by their furniture than by terrorists and bathtubs, right? Televisions, falling televisions.
Buckets, water buckets.
Yeah, and water buckets. But I think that again, that's not the only question we ask. I think when you move in national security circles, proof of effectiveness is seen as proof of legitimacy. If a program works in any way, that's the end of the debate and not a factor in the debate. But I would say that the framers of our Constitution created a different balance. They didn't write a Constitution that said the government can have whatever powers it needs to make us safer at all times. And even if Adam Smith thought that was the first duty, James Madison certainly didn't think it was the only duty of government. And so I think, of course, the police would be more effective if they could break down doors without warrants, and if they could, well, I was going to say stop us and frisk us, but I come from a city where that is allowed for some people. Yeah. But again, I think that the framers of the Constitution were more worried about a government with too much power than they were about the kinds of things that will occur if the government has limited and not total surveillance and law enforcement authority.
So then you're skeptical of the claims that came out, I think, after Snowden's leak. There were claims from the government saying that they've prevented something like 50 attacks, or they have prevented or have gotten information that's
Am I skeptical? Yes.
Yeah, clearly.
I'm skeptical. And again, I think that you have a lot of straw men here. I mean, I remember that when the first NSA scandal was revealed by a courageous whistleblower involving the Bush administration's warrantless NSA
2006.
wiretapping in 2000. Well, it's published in the New York Times in December of 2005. President Bush came forward and said, some folks think we shouldn't listen to Al-Qaeda's phone calls. I respectfully disagree, right? The question isn't should there be surveillance. The question should be under what rules and what laws. I don't think there's any persuasive evidence that these attacks were stopped because the NSA can collect all of our telephone metadata without a warrant. Right? The question isn't, does surveillance prevent attacks? It's these particular programs with these particular authorities and these particular rules. And I am extremely skeptical. And of course, when the journalists have looked at the examples that they have trotted out, almost all of them fall apart under scrutiny.
Right. Speaking of journalists, we haven't talked at all about Greenwald and Snowden, and I know you're going to say he's a hero. And
then I don't even have to say it.
Yeah, well, no. I don't want to get into the. I don't want to get into the whole.
Have to say it on TV.
Is he a narcissist debate? Or his flight plans? Nobody cares about that. Well, people do clearly, but unfortunately. But the question I posed to Ambassador Bolton, I sort of want to get your take. Do journalists have an obligation to act a certain way when they are presented with information?
Let me say this. I have no objection to the general practice of journalists in the United States to, when they get information that they don't understand fully, for them to sit down with the government and have a conversation. It is the general practice. The Guardian newspaper has in fact done that with some of the Snowden documents. So this isn't some kind of rogue operation.
The government before?
Yes, absolutely. Before the first articles were published, Guardian editors and reporters sat down with government officials. And certainly the Washington Post did the same thing. You haven't heard that, but I don't.
Conflict.
I don't. It could be. It's only a conflict if you, as a journalist, are giving the government veto power. So what the New York Times and the Guardian and Spiegel did when they had the WikiLeaks trove is they sat down in a room full of national security officials. They heard what they had to say. They made a redaction here and there, and then they put it on their front pages. That's what journalists should do. They need to make their own judgments. I think that the government has valuable input to give when it comes to, with the WikiLeaks documents in particular, protecting sources who the journalists may not know about. So I don't have any objection to that practice. In fact, I think that in a lot of cases it's the right practice, so long as the journalists are making the decision, the responsible decision for themselves about what the public should know.
But do you think, this is after the Snowden whole incident happened, Peter King was on the air, Representative Peter King from New York, he's a Republican. He said that Snowden obviously is a traitor, and that
obviously
in a situation like D-Day, for instance, we would have gone after somebody who leaked those plans. I mean, do journalists what I want to get at is,
I think so.
Is there a limit? Like, can we not leak?
We have not had in our history. Well, I guess there's one example of this that people tried out, which is that the Chicago Tribune in World War II did publish that the U.S. had broken Japanese codes. The government decided not to go after them because it would have brought more attention to the problem, and it sort of passed away. I don't think journalists should be publishing stories about attacks that are going to happen that should put our soldiers in danger, that should reveal legitimate sources and methods, that should expose undercover sources. But I don't think any journalists think they should be doing that either. And so, I'm not going to make a sweeping categorical statement that I can't imagine any scenario in which someone should not be liable for those kinds of actions. But I think that the journalists in this story have been acting profoundly in the public interest. And the evidence of that is the debates that we've been having about it, including this one.
And then in terms of surveillance in general, is there a limit to, what were you okay with? I mean, as far as, because technology is getting better to the point where government is going to be able to use surveillance methods in ways we can't even imagine. I mean, it's going to become part of life, essentially.
Well, I think so. And I think that the question that these revelations present to us, and it was one that had already been put to us for people who are watching these issues closely, is how does society respond to technology that makes it possible for the government and for corporations to collect and store almost all of our lives? Our principal protection against that in recent decades was not law, it was cost. On the law enforcement side, if the police wanted to know your location, it was a very cost-intensive operation for them to follow you around with cars, to have teams of officers doing it. And now one officer with a laptop can track hundreds of people over a long period of time. You know, on the corporate side, you know, the fact that there are companies that are trying to match up every one of your clicks on the internet for all of your activities with your identity and use that information is something that couldn't have been done in the past through marketing. And so the question we all have is, how do we protect ourselves against the more nefarious uses of that authority? Mm-hmm. I think that everyone would agree that that kind of power in the wrong hands is dangerous. And those kinds of powers put to our benefit can be really useful. We all like the GPS on our phones. That means that we don't have to print out directions. Every one of these technologies has positive uses and has dangerous uses. The only thing that protects us from the dangerous uses and points us towards the positive ones, I hate to say it, are law and rules. And the law and rules that we have right now are old, they're outdated, and they're not protective enough.
So are you saying the solution then would be more transparency, or?
I think transparency is necessary but not sufficient. I actually think, you know, this constitutional moment that we're in, I don't know if anybody had a chance to see Senator Wyden's speech today at the Center for American Progress. It was an extraordinary speech, and he used the term constitutional moment. I don't think it began with Snowden's revelations. I think you could say it began with the Supreme Court's decision in 2012 in the Jones case, where they applied Fourth Amendment protections to GPS tracking, which was a surprise to people in the national security state. They thought if you're walking around in public, what expectation of privacy do you have? And the court is beginning to realize that technology may require us to look at these kinds of rules differently and to put protections in place that we might not have needed before. I think it's an extraordinarily important discussion. I think transparency is step one. Let's have this debate in public, in the open, and not just, you know, briefed secretly to a few members of Congress who have their hair on fire because they're not allowed to talk about it.
But they would say that these are state secrets. There's a reason that there's this secretive process.
So I think that part of this really boils down to, in the end, what is legitimately secret and what is not. And that well, I mean, that would be an interesting debate to have. It's one that goes on all the time. I think probably everyone in this room would agree that some information is legitimately kept secret and confidential by the state. I would say it's a lot less than the government says. I think certainly information that would reveal troop movements, that would expose the identities of undercover officers, that would reveal the actual technical kinds of signals intelligence operation that they do that would allow it to be evaded, that kind of information can be secret. But you know, every study that looks at classification has concluded that, you know, 95% of information that's classified is improperly classified, well over 50%, whoever's looking at it. And that is a real problem.
But isn't also, I think, one of the criticisms people would say, or one of the fears people would bring up with this whole argument that transparency is the first step, is there's always the incentive for government to sort of disregard that. I mean, government has the incentives in place, does it not, to sure make nods to transparency, but they basically, you know, you can't watch the watchmen.
This is why I've always been just puzzled by the argument that we should defer to national security experts and officials on all of these questions. That it's a question of their expertise that we don't have and not the profound conflict of interest that exists. Their job is to exercise their authority aggressively. They are not willingly going to clip their wings and put any meaningful controls in place. And the reason why even liberal presidents don't do that is that they're surrounded by decent and smart national security advisors who say these programs are effective, that they work. There isn't anybody comparable in an administration who is representing the civil liberties side. And if you're a president and you go against the advice of your national security advisors and some kind of catastrophe occurs, it's politically extremely damaging. And that's why you need controls. This is what James Madison understood. That's why you need a Congress that can do real oversight. That's why you need courts that do real oversight. And when those break down, when Congress isn't doing its job and can't do its job, when the courts aren't doing their job because they refuse to or are prevented, that's when whistleblowers are an important check and very, very healthy for a democracy. That doesn't mean that every single thing that was leaked from Snowden was a great idea. People, I think, can legitimately conclude that he overreached in some areas. But fundamentally, the core information that he released should not have been secret in the first place. The country is better off now that it's public.
And with that, we are out of time. Thank you so much, Ben.
Thank you so much.